Haven's POV.
I stood in front of the mirror in the costume shop, staring at my reflection. Bolt after bolt after bolt of brightly colored fabrics and rack after rack of costumes surrounded me, but I fixated my eyes on the costume currently on my body. The bodice of the purple costume had a sweetheart neckline, with off-the-shoulder flutter sleeves adorned with flower petals. The petals also decorated the bodice, with rhinestones and flowers that started at the top of the neckline and met in the middle all the way down to the skirt. The skirt itself was a brilliant design, the fabric made to look like individual petals of a flower, starting in a deep purple near the bodice, and fading out to white at the edge, with more rhinestones scattered throughout. And glitter. There was glitter everywhere. Ouch! I cried out, breaking my concentration on myself. You were doing it again, Maya scolded. Doing what again? Your port de bras. I told you to hold still, otherwise you'll get jabbed. Sorry, I muttered, clasping my hands in front of my stomach so I wouldn't be tempted to move them anymore. She put the last pin in place and then stood up from the floor. So? What do you think? She asked. This was the first time I'd gotten to see the actual costume. My last fitting had been with the mock-up, and the tutu design had changed since then. This design was much more intricate, and I couldn't even fathom how many hours it had taken to piece it together. It's beautiful, I told her. But it's so glittery. This will take at least a week to disappear from my skin, and by then the ballet will be live and then I'll just be glittery for life. Maya laughed. Peter insisted. Why? He said, What? What did he say? I giggled. Peter always made the strangest comments. It was a running joke in the company. He said fairies like glitter. I laughed, and Maya giggled a bit with me. Come on, let's get you out of this, then we can head home, Maya said, shaking her head. I am so ready to clock out of here. I was right there with her. It was getting close to dinner time, and I was famished. The image of Maya's homemade ravioli flickered through my mind, and my stomach rumbled, making Maya laugh harder. Me too, Javi. Me too. I changed as quickly as I could, taking care to not poke myself with the pins Maya had placed or cause them to pop out of the costume. Then I waited for her at the door to the shop, playing with the end of my long French braid as she hung the tutu up with care. By Vivian, she called out, and the costume mistress waved at us as we left through the side door. Maya looped her arm through mine as we walked home. I was glad that I was wearing street clothes. Not that it embarrassed me to be a ballet dancer, but sometimes walking home in just my leotard, tights, and skirt made me self-conscious. Like everyone was staring at me, watching me, looking at me in my dance attire. But when I wore street clothes, it felt as though no one paid me any mind. When we reached our building, I immediately noticed a tall man with tousled sandy brown hair and a scruffy beard leaning against an old red pickup truck. I recognized him right away. Even if I hadn't seen him at the lake, I would have recognized his smirk from the pictures I had seen of him when we were kids. Sebastian, I said coolly, and Maya winced a little beside me. Did Wesley send you? Is he not man enough to beg forgiveness on his own? I wasn't sure why I said that. I had been thinking a lot since talking with Maya, and I was already having doubts about everything that had transpired all those years ago, was already contemplating what to say to Wesley. But seeing Sebastian there instead of Wesley irritated the shit out of me. No. He doesn't even know I'm here, he said. Oh. That was almost worse. I deflated a bit and turned to go into the building. As irritating as it was to think he'd sent his brother in his stead, it was more disappointing to know he didn't even care that much. Wait! Sebastian called. I wanted to tell you something. Something I know my brother won't tell you. So, you're going behind his back? I asked with a raised brow. No. Sebastian said. I know he'd tell you, eventually. But he won't do it now. Not when. He struggled with his words for a moment, then started again from the beginning. I'm confident he'd tell you in his own time, but I feel you need to know now, so you understand what type of person my brother actually is. He shoved his hands in his pockets. So. I glanced at Maya, and she shrugged too, then nodded. All right, You can come in, I told him.
Actually,
he began, looking sheepish. I need to take you somewhere. I paled slightly and took a step back. I hardly knew him, and he wanted me to just get in the car with him? I mean, we kind of knew each other when we were kids, but not really. Maya can come too, he said when he saw my face and my hesitance. But I promise you can trust me, he added. Fine, I said before I could change my mind. I stomped around to the passenger side, and Maya followed, sliding into the small back seat. I can sit there. My legs are shorter, I offered. It's fine, she said with a small smile. We all got buckled in, and then Sebastian pulled away from the curb, taking us away from the downtown area of the city and towards the suburbs. So, Haven Kenway, Sebastian said after a brief silence. Wainwright, I corrected, even though I hated that name. Maya coughed from the back seat, and I glared at her. Sparkles, you could change your last name to Skywalker and you'd still be Haven Kenway to us. Sparkles? I asked. Well, you're covered in glitter, so. I glanced down at my arms, and sure enough, the fucking purple glitter from my costume was everywhere, dancing in the sunlight from the window. See? I told you, I yelled, turning to Maya. But it will look so good on stage, she whined. Tell her, Sebastian. I have no clue what you're talking about, Sebastian said with a laugh. I turned forward with a huff and crossed my arms, the tail of my braid wrapping around my neck from the force of my movement. What is it you're trying to show me, Sebi? I asked, changing the subject. Maya quietly inhaled from the back seat, and Sebastian gave me a look. What? I asked. Usually I hate when people call me that, but... He kept looking at me weirdly, so I said, if you get to give me a nickname, it's only right that I get to give you one. He just continued to stare at me for a moment, then turned his eyes back to the road. That's fair, he grunted. So, where are we going? What is it your brother won't tell me about yet? Sebastian shifted in his seat and then said, well, when we didn't hear from you for a while, Wes sort of panicked. I nodded. I saw the letters he wrote that I never got, I told him in a quiet voice. He glanced at me and nodded, then continued. Our parents, and Nolan's parents, they worked together to try to adopt you. My arms loosened in front of me. What? I whispered. Yeah, he said. Felix and Fiona, Nolan's mom and dad, they were never able to have another kid, so when they heard social services had removed you from your home, they were more than willing to step up and take you in. They started thinking of you as their daughter before they'd even finished filing the paperwork. I swallowed against the lump forming in my throat, and I turned away from him to look out the window so he wouldn't see my eyes getting glassy. All that time, I thought everyone had abandoned me, but there had been people fighting for me all along. And one of them was the person I'd just pushed away from me. Obviously, that didn't work out, I mumbled. No, Sebastian sighed. It didn't. And Wes, well, he went ballistic. Maya gasped from the backseat, and I peeked at her to find her staring at the back of Sebastian's head with wide eyes. What do you mean? I asked. He was so upset. He yelled at everyone, and then he ran off into the forest for a few hours, he said. After that, we tried to find you. We hired people to search for you. But legally, there was only so much we could do outside of waiting to hear from you. And that never happened. I whipped my head around to him as he parked the car. I swear, I'm not saying you didn't, he stated, lifting his hands to appease me. I'm just saying we never received a letter from you. I blew out a breath, calming myself before I spoke to him again. I asked my mom about it yesterday, I admitted. She said she sent them, but I stopped myself. Sebastian was someone I barely knew. I didn't want to confess to him how I didn't trust my mom fully. He didn't push me to say more. He just opened his door and hopped out, coming around to open mine for me. Where are we? I asked him as I stepped onto the sidewalk, glancing around at the small single-story cookie-cutter homes on the street. "This is what I wanted to show you," he told me. "A street of typical American houses?" I teased. "No sparkles," he joked back. "I wanted to show you what's inside this house," he finished, pointing at the little blue house in front of us. I looked at it, but I saw nothing particularly special about it. It was just a house. Just a house similar to all the others on the street. A small house, with a tiny porch, wood siding, and white faux shutters on the exterior. Sebastian had already started making his way down the front walk, so I quickly fell into step behind him, Maya walking behind me. The front door opened before Sebastian even reached the steps, and someone said, "Sebastian, this is a pleasant surprise. We weren't expecting to see you today." I froze. It was impossible. 11 years had gone by since I heard that voice. It couldn't be her. She couldn't be in California. "I know, I would have called, but I wanted to surprise you," Sebastian said as he bounced up the stairs. "And I brought someone with me," he told her as he turned and nodded his head at me. Our gazes collided, and her hands flew up to her lips to cover them as she gasped. Sebastian looked back and forth between us, beaming, proud as a peacock. Maya came up next to me, reaching out to me to make sure I was all right, but I was already gone. There was no mistaking who was standing in that open doorway. No mistaking those soft blue eyes, that kind smile. They were exactly the same as they'd been almost 12 years before. Maybe a few more wrinkles, a few more gray hairs streaked among her brown strands, but otherwise the same. I ran the rest of the way to her, and found myself in her tight embrace, and the memory of every hug she'd ever given me flashed through my mind like my own personal movie. She pulled back to look at me, but I kept my arms wrapped around her, clinging to her like she was a lifeline. Her hands came to my face, cupping my cheeks gently as her eyes scanned my face. "You're so beautiful," she choked out in a hoarse voice. "My beautiful girl, all grown up," she whispered, pulling me back into her chest. "Shirley? Who is at the door?" Was that Sebastian I heard? My heart stopped. I couldn't believe it. But I'd heard it. Heard the voice I thought I would never hear again. I looked up at Shirley, and she smiled, then stepped aside so I could walk into their house. It didn't take long to find him. The living room was just off the entryway, and he sat on the couch, a cane within his reach. Again, he looked almost exactly like my memories of him, although his salt and pepper hair was fully gray, and the right side of his face didn't match the left side as well as it used to. His crooked smile wavered when he saw me. "Haven," he murmured, and I nodded, unable to form any words at the sight of him. I took slow steps forward until I was right in front of him, and his eyes tracked my every movement. I sat on the edge of the couch next to him, and a tear fell out of his eye. He lifted a trembling hand to brush it away, then leaned forward and pulled me into a hug. "What are you doing here?" I whispered as I clasped him in my arms. "We live here," Jack chuckled. I leaned back. "No, I mean, how are you here?" "Wesley, well, his parents, really, although it was his idea, they helped us. We moved here so I could get better treatment and physical therapy." I swallowed and nodded, blinking and pushing down the words that threatened to spill out. I didn't want to upset them, and I didn't want to get upset in front of them. They didn't need to see me crying and angry. This was a joyful moment for us, for them. And it was all thanks to Wesley Stone. "What about Scott? Tiffany?" I asked. "They live close enough to drive and visit," Jack told me with a smile. I looked back over to where Shirley stood, Seb and Maya behind her, and I smiled at him and said, "Thank you." "I'm not the one you need to thank," he replied with a shrug. "We'll let the three of you catch up," he said, then grabbed Maya's hand and pulled her towards what I could only guess was the kitchen. Shirley moved to sit on my other side and took one of my hands in hers. "This is so crazy," I said breathlessly. I move here to join a ballet company, and I told you she'd go far." Jack shouted in triumph, and Shirley shushed him. I smiled and continued, looking between the two of them. "I just can't believe it. First, seeing Wesley, and then the two of you. I shook my head. There was so much running through my head as we sat and talked and caught up with each other. It was beyond wild that they were in California, in the same town as the ballet company I joined, in the same area that Wesley and his family lived in. It was almost too much to be a coincidence. If I'd believed in a higher power, I would have thought someone had orchestrated the entire situation. But it wasn't divine intervention, and it wasn't coincidence. It was just Wesley, just because he couldn't help me, so he did the next best thing and helped Jack and Shirley. My parents. We had been talking for a long while when a knock sounded on the door, and it swung open immediately after. As if summoned by my thoughts, Wesley stood in the frame, his eyes widening as he saw me sitting on the couch with Jack and Shirley. He closed the door slowly behind him, his eyes locked on me, watching me for my reaction. "I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd be here, I swear. I come here every Wednesday at this time and dash." His eyes moved to my right, and I looked over to where Sebastian stood, grinning like the cat who got the cream. Wesley glared at him and then looked at me again. "I swear I didn't put him up to this, Haven," he explained, his voice desperate, begging me to believe him. I wanted to still be mad at him. I wanted him to be the villain of my heartbreaking story. It would be easier that way. But I knew he was telling the truth. I didn't think twice about what I did next. I jumped up from my spot between Jack and Shirley and strode to him with one singular goal. His face looked worried when I reached him, but I didn't pause. I just threw my arms around him, holding on to him as tight as I could. He hesitated for just a moment, then his arms wrapped around me, holding me close and with care. His muscular arms felt too good as they tightened around my body, and his large hands rubbed my back softly as we hugged. The gentle caresses were unexpected from such a strong, intimidating-looking man, and I closed my eyes for a second as I took in a deep, calming breath. I pulled back before I could let myself get drunk on the feel of his hands on my body, not wanting anyone, least of all him, to know how his touch affected me. Then I looked at him and muttered, "Did you still want to get coffee?"
Wesley's POV.
After exchanging phone numbers with Shirley and Jack and getting her bag from Seb's old beat-up truck and many hugs, Haven and I settled ourselves into my big black truck and headed back into town towards Brood Awakenings. Neither of us said anything as I drove to the cafe. I think she was still in shock from the whole thing. I was just happy that I seemed to be forgiven, and too afraid to say something to put me back in the Wolf house. I gripped the steering wheel hard, trying to keep my focus on the road instead of letting it wander over to her. My leaking kept trying to get me to look at her, and her jasmine scent filled up the cab fast, making him roll around on his back in my mind. She seemed much more relaxed than she had the day I showed up at her apartment. Her hands rested in her lap, and she stared out the window as we drove through town. There was so much I wanted to ask her, so much I wanted to know, but I didn't know where to even start, and I didn't want to overwhelm her. Especially not after she had just seen Jack and Shirley. So I was going to let her take the lead on the conversation. For now, anyway. "Where do you work?" she asked me as I turned down the street that led into town. "What?" I asked. She gestured towards my dress pants and shirt and loafers. "You clearly came to Jack and Shirley's from work. I am just curious about what you did. Do." I glanced down at my clothing for a moment. I had forgotten that I was still dressed for the office. "I work with my dad, running our various businesses," I told her. "Lots of paperwork. We rotate locations throughout the week to make sure each business gets the same amount of attention from us." "What businesses?" "We own a lot of the hotels near the National Park entrance, as well as various camping supply stores and things of that nature. Some restaurants and bars. The club." She nodded and looked back out the window. "I'd ask you where you work, but I think that's been established," I teased, and she chuckled. "Where did you go to school?" she asked. "Stanford," I replied, and she rolled her eyes. "What?" "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "What's wrong with Stanford?" She shook her head again, pressing her lips closed. "Well, where'd you go?" "Ballerinas don't go to college," she told me. "Or at least they don't usually. I went straight into an apprenticeship at 17 after I graduated a year early from high school. I joined the corps de ballet a year later, and then Peter offered me a soloist position here earlier this year after he saw me in the company's self-directed showcase. Can we pretend I have no idea what any of that means, so you can explain it all again in English? She let out a genuine laugh at that. Her head leaned back against the seat, and I smiled. Progress. That was progress. I would take any small moment I could and keep them to myself like the selfish ass I was when it came to her. Apprentice would be like an intern, she told me. The corps is the group of dancers that dance together all the time. They'd be like, what sport do you like? Football? I suggested. She nodded. Okay, so, the principals are like the quarterback. The soloists would be the wide receiver or running back. The corps would be the offensive and defensive lines. I stared at her as I paused at a stoplight. Did you just dash? The game would suck if the corps was shit, or if the soloists weren't good at their jobs, but the principal is the one most likely to be named MVP. I blinked and drove through the stoplight, impressed, and honestly, slightly turned on that she knew so much about football. I readjusted my position on the seat, trying to hide the semi I was sporting from the combination of her scent and her sports knowledge. What about the self-directed showcase thing? I asked, trying to move forward and distract myself from the dirty thoughts forming in my mind. Oh, that's just something the principal started doing a few years back. We get to perform pieces we wouldn't normally do, or self-choreograph some dances, or whatever we want, really. The company director gives us one night in the theater to perform. Sometimes directors from other companies will come and watch, and that's how Peter found me. I parked the car and nodded. Goddess bless Peter for bringing Haven here. I'd have to remember to thank him the next time I saw him. Don't get out, I exclaimed as I saw her reaching for the door handle. She frowned at me and kept her hand on it, pulling it towards herself to pop it open. Haven, I warned. But Dash. Damn it, would you just let me be a gentleman and open it for you? I said, holding back a growl, my eyes flashing with a gentle warning. Her eyes widened, and her mouth dropped open in surprise. Then she gave me a mischievous little wink and a smile and pushed the door open with surprising speed and strength and hopped out onto the curb. I growled for real after that. She had no clue what she had just incited, no idea about the beast she had just invited out to play. I chuckled darkly, my leakin mimicking me in my head, and then jumped out of the truck after her, slamming the door and rounding the hood of the truck in long strides to find her already almost at the door of the coffee shop. I sped up my steps and grabbed the handle at the same time she did, pushing against the door so she couldn't pull it open. Her back pressed against my front as she tried and failed to strong-arm it open, and I didn't even try to take a step back to give her space. I was too focused on the feel of her body against mine, and distracted by my leakin fucking purring again. She turned her face and glared up at me, her blue eyes sparkling with a bit of fire and defiance. You'll have to be faster than that, twinkle toes, I teased, bringing my hand to her hip to brace our bodies as I pulled the door open. After you, I muttered with a smirk. She stepped away from my body and into the crowded cafe, stopping in her tracks as she looked around at all the people sitting and standing at the tables. The line went almost to the door, so I squeezed in between her body and the table nearby, keeping close to her without touching her. Almost half of the shop had their eyes glued to us as we stood in line and worked our way to the register. Most of them were wolves from my pack, but a handful were from one of the two neighboring packs that also bordered the national park. I could sense she was uncomfortable with the crowd, but I didn't know what was appropriate to do to put her at ease. If she was a wolf, I wouldn't hesitate to wrap my arms around her and hold her close to calm her with my touch. But she was a human, so I did the next best thing I could think of, and let a bit of my alpha aura slip out, forcing the lower wolves to turn their eyes away from us. The wolves who weren't part of my pack were still affected and went back to their business. Even some humans bristled and shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Haven was the only being in the cafe who wasn't affected at all. I stepped up as close as I could without actually touching her, letting her sweet scent fill my lungs. I was still trying to place the fruit that was mixed with the jasmine in her scent. It was right there, at the edge of my mind, on the tip of my tongue. The teenaged wolf who was working the register caught my eye, and I realized we were the next customers. I placed my hand on the small of Haven's back as we stepped up to the counter, and she gave me a shy smile. I blinked at the contrast from the Haven who gave me sass as she ran out of my truck into the cafe door. Had I imagined that whole thing? What did you want? I asked, leaning down to speak quietly to her. Oh, you go ahead, I'm still deciding, she muttered, looking back at the menu and the case of baked goods and sandwiches. I smiled at her and placed my usual afternoon coffee order, a cappuccino with extra foam and a hint of caramel. In the mornings I was a black coffee guy, but any other time I like to have a foamy, slightly sweet cappuccino. Haven? I asked, gesturing at the barista. She glanced at me and the barista and then me again and laughed. Oh, no, it's okay, I can pay for my own order, she said, waving me off. Cue angry leaking in my head. Like hell we were letting her pay for her own order. Haven, I said again, a bit more sternly. Seriously, Wes, I can buy my own cup of coffee. They do pay me at the ballet company, you know, she replied, shaking her head. I gritted my teeth to keep the growl from spilling out. She sure did like pushing my buttons. Remember what I said in the car? About letting me be a gentleman? I reminded her. She stared at me, then sighed and relented, stomping over to the barista at the register. I smirked, and then had to press my lips together to prevent myself from muttering "good girl" to her as she stepped in front of me. I'll have a medium vanilla oat milk latte with cinnamon sprinkled on the top. Extra hot, please, she rushed out in one breath. Her eyes flicked over to the case of food, and then she turned to look at me. Aren't you forgetting something? I asked her. No? Food? I'm not hungry. Funny, I said, stepping closer to her and leaning my elbow on the counter as I bent to her level. Because your stomach was growling almost the entire time we were in my truck. It's fine, Wes, she said, crossing her arms. Order some food, or I will order it for you, I threatened with a teasing smile. I didn't know her that well. Not like I used to, anyway, but I could already sense she wouldn't like someone ordering food for her. We locked eyes in a staring contest, both of us stubbornly holding our own and not backing down. When she finally blinked, I grinned in triumph. She furrowed her brow and turned to place the rest of her order, and I'm pretty sure I heard her mutter, the audacity, under her breath. I'll take the grilled chicken pesto sandwich, she spat out, then moved to the only table available, a standing one right near the handoff bar. I smiled at the barista and handed her my card, then joined Haven after I finished paying. You didn't have to pay, she muttered. Of course I did, I grumbled back. I invited you here. It's only polite. Technically, I invited you. Technically. I invited you first, I pointed out. And you stood me up. She opened her mouth to protest, but the server set her sandwich down in front of her, so she closed her mouth and tried to smile at them. Thank you, she said. So you owe me, I finished. Seriously, Wes? I nodded. Fine, but it's not a date. Says who? I asked, moving around the table to stand closer to her. She ignored me and took a bite of her sandwich, staring out the window to avoid my eyes. Who said this wasn't a date, Haven? I asked again, coming right up next to her, my chest brushing her arm with each inhale. I pretended not to notice the little shiver that ran through her body, or the goosebumps that appeared on her forearm just below her pushed-up sleeves. What if I wanted to be a date? I asked, leaning down towards her ear. She turned to look at me. Her nose almost touched mine, and her pupils dilated as we made eye contact. She moved forward, until her lips were just across from mine, her tongue darting out to lick them, and my eyes tracked the movement, my cock twitching as it grew hard again. Then I would say, it's very presumptuous of you to just assume I would even want to date you, she cooed, then turned away from me and took a very large, very unladylike bite of her sandwich. The scent of roasted garlic wafted towards me as she set the sandwich back on the plate, and I was grateful that at that exact moment, the barista called my name for our drinks. As adorable as she was chewing her sandwich the way a wolf would, and as much as I wanted to be as close to her as she'd allow, the garlic scent made my nose itch and my eyes water. Kissing her after this date was probably off the table. Well, it was off the table, anyway. She wasn't a wolf. She was human. They didn't move as quickly as we did when they were in relationships. I needed to keep reminding myself of that. And my leakin'. I picked up our drinks and brought them back to the table, testing the weight of my cappuccino as I handed Haven her latte. Oh, good. They got the foam right this time, I exclaimed, and she raised a brow at me. Usually they skimp on the foam, I explained. Lots of people don't like foam, and I don't understand why they order a cappuccino if they don't like the foam. If you want more milk, just order a latte. The ratio of the espresso to milk to foam is what makes it a cappuccino. And I was rambling. A fucking gain. About foam, of all things. Fucking steamed milk. Haven was just smiling at me with her brows still raised as she sipped her latte. I probably sounded like a pompous windbag. How do you know so much about football? I asked to change the subject and steer us away from my coffee proclivities. My adopted parents are BYU fans, Haven answered as she set her cup down. They had season tickets every year. I had to learn or it would have bored me to death. She frowned a bit and looked at her cup, turning it side to side on the tabletop. What? I asked, immediately concerned and on alert. She shook her head at me and ate the last bite of her sandwich. I blinked and held in my "I told you so" to her. She must have been starving to have finished that whole sandwich that fast. But I was more worried about what had made her so upset. She may have brushed it off, but I could see it in her eyes that she wasn't okay. My leakin' was on edge too, ready to defend and protect what we had both decided was ours. I moved closer to her again, only this time it was to hide her face from the rest of the cafe and offer her some comfort and safety instead of to push her buttons and tease her. You can talk to me, Haven, I breathed. You can trust me, I added, covering her hand on the coffee cup with my own, stilling her anxious movements. I don't know if she did it intentionally, but she leaned into my touch at my words, her body moving into my space as if seeking solace. Not here, she whispered. There are too many people. Would you like to go for a walk? I asked her. When she nodded, I grabbed both of our drinks and walked to the door, holding it open for her to exit the shop. Once she was out the door, I handed her the cup and put my hand on her back to guide her towards the park.
Wesley's POV.
We walked through the park, with Haven deep in thought as she continued to drink her latte. She had both of her hands wrapped around the cup to keep them warm, and I mentally kicked myself for not realizing that it was getting dark and therefore getting cooler outside. We stopped on the small wooden footbridge and she set her cup on the railing, folding her arms around herself as she leaned against it. We can go back to your apartment if you're cold, I told her, setting my cup next to hers and reaching out to stroke her arm a little. I'm fine, she replied, and I nodded, but kept my hand on her. As she stood there, staring out at the stream that ran through the park, I waited for her to be ready to speak to me. I didn't want to push her. I knew I was slowly gaining her trust, and I didn't want to take any steps backwards. But my leakin' was on edge, sensing her distress and anxiety and mine as well. Thank you, she said out of the blue, breaking my leakin' from his angry pacing. For the coffee? I chuckled. It's really not that big of a deal, I dash. Not for the coffee, Wes, she said, looking at me with meaning. I swallowed and nodded, my thumb rubbing her shoulder. I did what I could, I muttered. When I discovered you had been adopted, I felt so helpless. So I did the next best thing I could think of, I told her. And I would have told you. Eventually. At some point. I was working on a plan to grovel, and... Grovel? How? Well, I hadn't actually figured out what I was going to do, but I was going to do it, I admitted with an embarrassed laugh. She laughed softly, then said, I thought I'd never see them again. You could have looked them up on Google or something. No, I mean, she shook her head and chewed on her lip, her arms wrapping tighter around herself. The first year Matthew and Melissa had the season tickets, they tried to. One of the games was the same weekend as the Youth America Grand Prix, that's a big prestigious ballet competition. And they told me I had to choose between going to the game and going to the competition, she told me, changing the subject. I held back my anger and true feelings at this revelation and her using their first names instead of calling them her parents. Barely. And you chose the competition? Yeah, she said. I'm guessing there's more to this story? I asked with the barest amount of restraint, and she nodded. And I'm guessing I'm not going to like it? I chose the competition, but they chose the game, she said in a voice so quiet even I had to strain to hear. Excuse me? I growled, seeing red. I removed my hand from her arm and grabbed onto the railing, needing to keep myself from hurting her. I needed to keep my rage and my leaking in check. Did you miss it? I asked her through clenched teeth. No, she answered with a shake of her head. I had to ask another dancer's family to give me a ride, but I was able to go. How old? 13. Fuck, Haven, I'm sorry, I mumbled, my hand forming into a fist and slamming down onto the rail. It's okay, she shrugged. No, it's not, I told her. I don't personally know what it's like, but I've seen how Reed would get when his dad would miss out on shit. It's not okay, Haven. They went to everything else. But they never really tried to understand ballet and why it was important to me. They just wrote the checks and drove me where I needed to be. I clenched my jaw and leaned over the railing, clasping my hands together so my claws wouldn't come out. For a long time, I didn't think much of it, she continued. Well, at first I was too young to realize there was something not right. They adopted me and took care of me. Our relationship was never amazing, but it was never bad either. I nodded as I listened to her talk, still holding back the beast inside. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to hurt someone or have me grab her and kiss her pain away, but neither were good options. Then, when I was older, I was just so happy to be dancing, to be doing something I loved, that I brushed off a lot of things or ignored them altogether because I didn't want to think about it. It was easier for me to just not acknowledge it. I was healthy. I had everything I needed, everything I wanted. But after last weekend, and today, she stopped, her head tilting up towards the darkening sky as she blinked her eyes rapidly, the tip of her nose turning pink. You what? I asked, standing up straighter. It didn't escape my notice the other day that she'd hid her tears from me once she realized she was crying. Maybe she saw it as a weakness, or maybe she just never let people see that side of her, but I didn't want her to hide it. Not from me, anyway. They told me you died, she said in a hoarse voice, followed by a sharp, shaky intake of breath that was almost a sob. I stood stock still, unable to breathe. My heart was in my feet, and my stomach was in my throat. I had no words. They told me Jack died, and Shirley was put in a home for mental health issues, and she sniffled and turned her head away from me, faking a cough to cover her sobs. I doused the fiery anger threatening to consume me quickly because of her shaking shoulders and trembling body. As furious as I was, I had to put it aside and deal with it later, because I needed to tend to her feelings first. But make no mistake, I would lash out later. I would look into these people. I would burn the world down if it meant she would live the rest of her life without harm. I placed my hands on her upper arms again with a gentle touch and stepped up close to her, leaving just a small bit of space, trying to ignore the electricity crackling between us. I wanted to turn her around and wrap her up tight, hold her to me, and never let her go. But I also wanted it to be her decision. I wanted her to come to me. I wanted her to need me. Need me the way I was realizing I needed her. That's what you meant when you said you thought you'd never see them again. She nodded, and I caressed her arms with slow movements. I took a small step closer to her, and at the same time she spun towards me, closing the distance between us and burying her face in my chest. Her hands clutched at my shirt, gripping the fabric in her fists. For the second time that day, I found myself wrapping my arms around her, holding her against my body, keeping her safe and close. I hadn't gotten to hold her as long as I wanted earlier, since she stepped away from me before I had a chance to drink in the feel of her in my arms. This time, though, the reason for me holding her was different, and I had to shift my focus to consoling her, to being her strength as opposed to enjoying our closeness. Not that I minded. My Leakin, while upset that someone had hurt her, was pleased she was turning to us for comfort. I held her tightly and just let her cry, just let her release her held in grief, frustration, confusion, and pain. My body swayed from side to side in a gentle, soothing motion as her cries quieted to soft sighs and whimpers and sniffles. Why would they do that? She whispered, her hands pulling me even closer to her. Why would they lie to me? Maybe they were jealous? I asked, not voicing my true suspicions or thoughts. There was no way that was the real reason. There had to be something else going on, some other reason for them to do that. That's a pretty awful reason to lie to a child, she spat. I know, I murmured, my hands caressing her back. I know. My nose pressed into the top of her head, burying into her hair. Maybe they thought he would. Maybe they thought they were protecting you. Or maybe they didn't know. I suggested, her fiery strands tickling my lips. That's not the only thing they lied about, she continued. They lied to me about the letter I sent you. Maybe not. Maybe she did send it and it got lost. But then why tell me that you intentionally didn't write me back? Why work so hard to convince me you didn't really care? Why not just say it might have been lost and have me send another? And it wasn't just one letter. It was several. There is no way all of them were lost. I swallowed and squeezed her tighter. I had no response to that, no logical explanation to give her. I don't know, Haven, I murmured. I'm not sure how long we stood there. I lost track of time as the sun disappeared behind the treetops. She kept herself pressed firmly against me, clinging to me, and I didn't want to let her go. I wanted to stay like this with her for as long as she'd let me. When she pulled away, her eyes scanned my face before looking down at my chest. Oh no. Shit, I'm sorry. I got tears and snot all over your clothes, she exclaimed, her hands tucking into her sleeves and rubbing at my shirt. I tilted my head down to look at the spot she was wiping at, and, sure enough, there was a big wet splotch on my chest from where she'd been resting her head. I removed one hand from her back and took both of hers in mine to stop her unsuccessful attempts to clean my shirt. It's okay, I told her. I don't mind. It's gross, she said, scrunching her nose. And embarrassing. It's fine, I reiterated, shaking my head. Don't worry about it. Inside, my Leakin was happy that I stopped her, excited that her scent would be on us until we returned home. I held back an exasperated sigh and an eye roll from his antics in my head. He was ridiculous. It's not though, she continued. I totally ruined our date. I tilted my head and quirked an eyebrow at her as she looked up at me. I thought this wasn't a date. She blushed and then sighed. Maybe it's a little bit like a date, she conceded. I smirked and pulled her closer with her hands. Well, how about I take you on something that is a lot like a date on Friday? I asked her, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face and letting my fingers linger on her skin. There you go, being presumptuous again, she teased, tilting her face up towards mine. So I'll pick you up around 6? Fine, she muttered, but her smile betrayed her. Our eyes stayed locked together, our faces close enough that if I wanted to, I could count the dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. The flowery, fruity scent of her mixed with that of the cool evening and the trees and the stream nearby, forcing all of my senses to focus on her and her alone. I thought about closing the distance and giving in to the magnetic pull towards her that I felt growing stronger the longer I was with her. It would be easy to just lower my mouth to hers and give her a gentle kiss. Human, 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 I chanted in my head, reminding myself that they didn't move as fast as we did in relationships. Her eyes flitted down to my mouth and then back up, and then she was out of my arms and back at the railing, fidgeting with her coffee cup. I should head home, she said, not meeting my eyes. Maya is probably getting worried. I held in my laugh. Maya wouldn't be worried. She knew Haven was safe with me. She knew I was more than capable of protecting her, of taking care of her. And even if she did start to worry, she would just mind-link me to ask me what was going on. But Haven didn't know that. Not yet, anyway. I almost stumbled in my tracks as we walked. Fuck. I hadn't thought about how or when I would tell her about that. About what we all really were. I would have to make a plan for that. Maybe ask someone for advice. I racked my brain, trying to think of who in our pack had a human mate, but I came up blank. I'd have to ask my mom. Which meant telling her about Haven. Which meant my dad would find out. I nearly groaned as I grabbed her bag out of my truck for her. My dad. He wouldn't care about her being human or me wanting her as my mate, but he would be mad that I didn't tell him she was here. It had been almost a week that I had known and I'd not said one word to them about it. But I was going to need his help anyway. I wanted to look into her parents. Find out if there was more to them than met the eye. Haven stopped in front of her apartment building, and I pulled myself out of my panic so I could say goodbye to her. "Don't forget," I said to her as I handed the bag to her. 6 o'clock. "I'm sure you'll send me excessive reminder texts," she joked. "I won't have to if you actually show up this time," I teased back, crossing my arms. "Well, it will be hard to not show since you're picking me up," she reminded me. I chuckled and stepped up into her personal space, my body only centimeters from hers, my hand cupping her jaw. "Just be ready," I commanded. "Wear something nice." "Bossy," she said in a breathy voice, the hairs on her skin standing on edge and her heart stuttering in her chest. "You like it," I replied. "Do I?" Her eyes flashed with a challenge. I inhaled through my nose, picking up a hint of her arousal from my proximity and my touch and my aura. I leaned even closer, so my lips brushed her ear as I said, "Yes, you do." She swallowed, and I moved backwards, watching her as she turned to go into her building. "Friday!" I called out to her as she stepped through the doorway, and she shook her head and laughed as the door shut behind her.